Good afternoon. This is Pastor Damon Laker. I had hoped to have something together for all of us on Wednesday, but I was not doing a very good job of getting it figured out. So this is a first-time effort, and we hope that it will go well. But I'd like to share with you what we would have had on Wednesday evening if we had been together for Midweek Lent. We would have heard the prayer of St. Francis. Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is injury, let me sow pardon. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. And where there is sadness, joy. O divine Master, that I may not seek so much to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive. It is in forgiving that we are forgiven. And it is in dying that we are born to eternal life. Then we would have heard from the speaker that day on the section that says, and where there is sadness, joy. And this is the story that would have been told. There was a time in my life 20 years ago when I was driving cab for a living. It was a cowboy's life, a gambler's life, a life for someone who wanted no boss, constant movement, and the thrill of a dice roll every time a new passenger got into the cab. What I didn't count on when I took the job was that it was also a ministry. Because I drove the night shift, the car became a rolling confessional. Passengers would climb in, sit behind me in total darkness and anonymity, and tell me of their lives. We were like strangers on a train. The passengers and I, hurtling through the night, revealing intimacies we would never have dreamed of sharing during the brighter light of day. In those hours I encountered people whose lives amazed me, emboldened me, made me laugh, and made me weep. And none of those lives touched me more than that of a woman I picked up late on a warm August night. I was responding to a call from a small brick fourplex in a quiet part of town. I assumed I was being sent to pick up some partiers or someone who had just had a fight with a lover, or someone going off to an early shift at some factory in the industrial part of town. When I arrived at the address, the building was dark except for a single light in a ground floor window. Under these circumstances, many drivers would just honk once or twice, wait a short minute, then drive away. Too many bad possibilities awaited a driver who went up to a darkened building at 2:30 in the morning. But I had seen too many people trapped in a life of poverty who depended on the cab as their only means of transportation. Unless the situation had a real whiff of danger, I always went to the door to try to find the passenger. It might, I reasoned, be someone who needed my assistance. Would I not want a driver to do the same if my mother or father had called for a cab? So I walked to the door and knocked. "Just a minute," answered a frail and elderly voice. I could hear the sound of something being dragged across the floor. After a long pause, the door opened. A small woman somewhere in her 80s stood before me. She was wearing a print dress and a pillbox hat and with a veil pinned on it, like you might see in a costume shop or at a Goodwill store or in a 1940s movie. But by her side was a small nylon suitcase. The sound had been her dragging it across the floor. The apartment looked as if no one had lived in it for years. All the furniture was covered with sheets. There were no clocks on the walls, no knickknacks or utensils on the counters. In the corner was a cardboard box filled with photos and glassware. "Would you carry my bag out to the car?" she said. "I'd like a few moments alone. Then if you could come back and help me. I'm not very strong." I took the suitcase to the cab, then returned to assist the woman. She took my arm and we walked slowly toward the curb. She kept thanking me for my kindness. "It's nothing," I told her. "I just try to treat my passengers the way I would want my mother treated." "Oh, you're such a good boy," she said. Her praise and appreciation were almost embarrassing. When we got to the cab, she gave me an address, then asked, "Could you drive through downtown?" "It's not the shortest way," I answered. "Oh, I don't mind," she said. "I'm in no hurry. I'm on my way to a hospice." I looked in the rearview mirror. Her eyes were glistening. "I don't have any family left," she continued. "The doctor said I should go there. He says I don't have very long." I quietly reached over and shut off the meter. "What route would you like me to go?" I asked. For the next 2 hours we drove through the city. She showed me the building where she had worked as an elevator operator. We drove through the neighborhood where she and her husband had lived when they had first been married. She made me pull up in front of a furniture warehouse. that had once been a ballroom where she had gone dancing as a girl. Sometimes she would have me slow down in front of a particular building or corner, and would sit staring out into the darkness, saying nothing. At the first hint of the sun was creasing the horizon, she suddenly said, "I'm tired. Let's go now." We drove in silence to the address she'd given me. It was a low building, like a small convalescent home, with a tar driveway that passed under a portico. 2 orderlies came out to the cab as soon as we pulled up. Without waiting for me, they opened the door and began assisting the woman. They were very solicitous, intent, watching her every move. They must have been expecting her. Perhaps she had phoned them right before we left. I opened the trunk and took the small suitcase up to the door. The woman was already seated in a wheelchair. "How much do I owe you?" she asked, reaching into her purse. "Nothing," I said. "You have to make a living," she answered. "There are other passengers," I responded. Almost without thinking, I bent over and gave her a hug. She held on to me tightly. "You gave an old woman a little moment of joy," she said. "Thank you." There was nothing more to say. I squeezed her hand once, then walked out into the dim morning light. Behind me I could hear the door shut. It was the sound of the closing of a life. I did not pick up any more passengers that shift. I drove aimlessly, lost in thought. Through the remainder of that day I could hardly talk. What if that woman had gotten a driver who had been angry, or abusive, or impatient to end his shift? What if I had refused to take the run, or had honked once, then driven away? What if I'd been in a foul mood and had refused to engage the woman in conversation? How many other moments like that had I missed or failed to grasp? We are so conditioned to think that our lives revolve around great moments, but great moments often catch us unawares. When the woman hugged me and said that I had brought her a moment of joy, it was possible to believe that I had been placed on earth for the sole purpose of providing her with that last ride. I do not think that I have ever done anything in my life that was more important. When Francis tells us to bring joy where there is sadness, it seems like a command that is out of balance. It is fair to ask us to bring solace where there is sadness, or to provide comfort where there is sadness, but to bring joy seems to be too much to ask. We tend to forget that sadness is like an empty room, filled with the gloom that covers everything like a shroud, closes down the heart and envelops us in a dreary isolation. Try as we might, we can't escape. The efforts of our friends to bring us consolation seem distant and unreal. We appreciate them, but they do not touch the core of our isolation. We live inside the sepulchre of the Spirit. When, for a brief moment, someone is able to break through and touch us, it seems like a ray of sunlight that fills our entire heart. We know in that moment that we are alive and that our heart will heal. To the bringer, it seems like no more than consolation. But to the person wrapped in the shroud of sadness, it feels more like joy. It is the affirmation and connection that reunites them with the human family. How are we to know what act will bring this reconnection? Will it be a kind word, a bouquet of flowers, a short walk or conversation, or maybe a crosstown ride in a cab? Almost always it's something small. Those lost in a deep sadness will not assent to great efforts. They are too bound to the sadness that engulfs them, but they will permit the small acts. And though these small acts may seem like nothing to the giver, they have the possibility of being the miraculous touch that heals. Francis, in all of Christianity and maybe all of organized religion, is the greatest proponent of joy. He understood better than any other the power that it has to heal a heart. When he calls us to sow joy where there is sadness, he is reminding us that a person engulfed in sadness is trapped in the prison of self-referential loneliness. It may seem that the highest act we can perform is to try and enter that prison and share the sadness. And indeed, that may be the way to unlock the door to the isolated heart. But to help that heart come forth from the darkness, we must somehow bring in light from the outside. We must not only enter the room of their sadness, we must also hold the door open so that light can shine in. Under normal circumstances, I might have sat with the woman who was quite literally going off to die. I might have tried to console her and empathize with her and make her feel less alone. It would have been a good gesture, and a kind one. But because I was on a job, I could not embrace her loneliness and try to enter it. I had to acknowledge it with a gentle touch, but I had to stay present to the outside world. Though I did not know it at the time, I was doing the very thing that Franciscans counseled. It was only after she hugged me and spoke those poignant words that I began to understand. We must remind ourselves that consolation is but the first step in healing. It is our way of saying that we share, or at least honor, another person's sadness. But healing has not truly taken place until the person lays down the sadness and returns to the fullness of life. If we would follow in the footsteps of Francis, we must look beyond consolation to joy and seek the small, unexpected gesture that can create that joy. We don't always get it right. Often we will miss the mark entirely. But when we find the exact touch that brings light into the lonely room of another's sadness, we are being true artists of the Spirit. We are creating joy where there is sadness and helping another's spirit burst forth into song. It is a joy to be your pastor at this time, and I trust that God will continue to bring joy into our lives. God bless.